Like human beings, many non-human animals, we have every reason to believe, suffer, and their suffering matters to them as our suffering matters to us. Like us, Regan tells us, they bring a unified psychological presence to the world. Like us, they are some bodies, not some things. Despite this, human beings continue to treat these individuals in ways that utterly disregard or fail to appreciate these facts. Consider the way non-human animals are treated in farms. The philosopher Stuart Rachels writes, "Cows are routinely mutilated, hot iron branded, and castrated. Their tails are docked. They are dehorned through sensitive tissue, and their ears are cut for identification. And all of this, of course, without pain relief. Chickens in the egg industry are also mutilated. Parts of their beaks are severed without pain relief. A chicken's beak is rich in nerve endings, so the debeaking causes them severe pain." And really, anyone even moderately informed knows that these beings suffer horribly their entire lives. The following seems to me to be a true moral proposition, if ever there was one. In the absence of some terribly important reason, we ought not to inflict intense and prolonged suffering on vast numbers of beings or pay other people to do this. And as far as I can tell, there is no terribly important reason to cause all this suffering, assuming, of course, that taste pleasures or small inconveniences are not terribly important reasons. And so we should be vegan. We should boycott animal products. Well, one fairly common objection to veganism is that one's individual consumer choices don't make any difference. There are a couple of things one might say about this. One is that considering how often we buy food products, it's not so unreasonable to suppose that on some of those occasions, one's decision to purchase some meat, say, will actually cause the meat sales to exceed some threshold, causing the seller to place a larger order, resulting in a greater number of non-human animals who will exist, suffer, and be killed. Something like this seems not all that unreasonable. Second, given the magnitude of the benefits in question, even a small probability of one's individual choices making a difference, I think, is sufficient reason to boycott these products. And finally, there's also this. Even if it were overwhelmingly unlikely for one's individual choices by themselves to make a difference, by being vegan, one will rather likely influence others to make similar changes, which can have a kind of knock-on effect. And we know that if a large number of people make these sorts of changes, such changes will affect production. Some also argue that taste pleasures can be sufficient to justify other animal industries. Such a person might, for example, ask, what if the intense suffering of one cow for a year could produce palate pleasure for people on countless individual occasions? Couldn't this be justified? Or they might say, couldn't an extremely large number of small or trivial benefits justify the suffering caused to the cow? Well, there are several reasons to doubt this, I think. Notice similar arguments can be advanced for bringing back gladiatorial contests, gladiator games, provided enough people would enjoy such events. We might ask a similar question. Could the pleasure of some very large number of spectators justify the intense suffering of a small number of gladiators? First of all, there are many who take the position that no sum of benefits can justify inflicting suffering on these victims because these individuals have a right not to be treated in this way. So these are just straightforward violations of rights. This is one possible view. One might also take the position that no amount of pleasure can justify inflicting pain because preventing pain is always more important than producing pleasure. But what if we were to redescribe the situation in terms of suffering? That is, someone may well ask, what if enough people suffer slightly from not having their desires for these things satisfied? Could the satisfaction of a very large number of such desires, in other words, a very large number of people being relieved from mild frustration, outweigh the suffering of these victims. Suppose we say, for the sake of argument, that they could, at least in principle, outweigh the victim's suffering, that these practices could produce a net reduction in suffering. Even if this were the case, this would not actually justify these practices. Why? Because there are other ways to satisfy these desires. Gladiatorial contests are not the only way to entertain people. Animal products are not the only way to satisfy taste-related desires. If we can derive similar benefits without causing harm, or nearly as much harm, obviously we ought not to choose the harmful way to derive these benefits. Consider, for example, the following case. Imagine that there are two ways to prevent A from being tortured. One is to cause B a mild headache. The second is to flip a switch or something, preventing A's torture and causing no harm to B or anyone else. Even though causing B to suffer the lesser pain is arguably much better than allowing A to be tortured, it's surely not what one ought to do, since there's an alternative, namely flipping a switch that involves no suffering or harm. Thus, it's not enough, even on utilitarian grounds, to show that some practice prevents more suffering than it causes. One has to show that there was no better alternative available. But what if there were no other way to satisfy these desires? Would we then be committed to accepting these practices? Again, for those who accept rights for humans as well as other sentient beings, the answer will be no. What about those who believe that the right thing to do in any given situation is whatever will produce the best expected outcome overall? The answer, I think, again, is no. And that's because it seems to me, beyond a certain duration, intense pain is, as philosophers sometimes say, lexically worse than minor trivial pains. And what this basically means is that even though each additional minor pain makes an outcome worse, no amount of the minor pains can be worse than an intense pain beyond a certain duration. If this seems implausible, consider two possible lives: 1 year of agony and 1 billion years of mild frustration. Most, I think, would prefer the second life. This suggests that probably no amount of mild frustration can outweigh a year of intense suffering. Thus, the cow's suffering is worse than a huge number of slightly unsatisfied people. And we could say more or less the same thing about gladiatorial contests. Mild frustration is a trivial reason, and these reasons do not add up to become an important one. So I think, again, we must confront the fact that we are imposing vast amounts of suffering on individuals that matter for trivial reasons. And one need not, it seems to me, reflect on this matter long to recognize that this is something morally objectionable. To paraphrase, again, Stuart Rachels, the philosophical arguments are easy. What's hard is getting people to stop eating animal products.